Good evening, and welcome to the Precision Livestock Farming and Sensing Technology in Extensive Grassland System webinar. Tonight, I'm going to talk to you about precision livestock farming in extensive grassland system in Europe. My name is Claire Morgan-Davies. I'm a researcher at Scotland Rural College in Scotland. So, an outline of what I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm going to explain a little bit what the extensive grassland systems are in Europe, a little overview. Then we'll go on to talk about the PLF, precision livestock farming, and then really the state of the art. So what sorts of initiative already exist? And I'm going to show you a little sample of what's out there, and then briefly touch on the future issues. So where are the extensive grassland systems in Europe? Well, you've got on this map, the map of permanent grassland as a fraction of total agricultural land areas. And you can see the area in dark green are where we have most of the permanent grassland, and they tend to be at the fringe of Europe. Now, if we remember that map and then compare it with the less favored area map, which is the map on the left, you can see that there is the area which are very dark brown and orange, and they are the area that are very challenged in terms of social, environmental, and climatic issues and topographic issues. And they tend to coincide with where the permanent grasslands area are already. Similarly, in the same areas, we notice that the precipitation and the climate is also quite extreme, with a lot of precipitation in these areas of extensive grassland system. Now, again, to go back to that map I was showing you at the start, you can see that if we superimpose this map of permanent grassland with the map of where the high nature value area are in Europe, there is definitely a match. So these permanent grassland area or extensive areas are very often in less favored areas, so challenged area, but they're also very important in terms of biodiversity. So they play an important role in terms of social and also ecosystem services and biodiversity. So what sort of production type do we find in these areas? Well, if we go again, the percentage of livestock in Europe, more than half are sheep and cattle and goats, but a third of them are really goats and sheep. And in these areas, we tend to find the majority of the sheep and goats, but also some cows, some hardy breeds, some cattle, as you can see on the pictures. So there is quite a variation and a very diversity of type of production. And also, depending on the geographical location, we have a meat production orientated livestock, or we tend to also have milk production with a cheese production. And some areas are also dual production. We tend to find the meat production more in the north and west of Europe, while the milk and cheese production tends to be more in the south and more Mediterranean base. So if we think of the challenge that this area faced, and I've already alluded to the climate, for example, so these areas are remotely based and they have a very harsh environment, whether it's too hot or too cold. And that leads to survival issues, which also mean that in terms of welfare, there are some issues in this system. These systems are also very diverse, as I was alluded to in the previous slides, and the sector tends to be less organized. It's also a more traditional and quite aging sector, and that suffers a lot from the lack of labor, going back to the problem of the LFAs. This system tends to have a low productivity and not very efficient, and that leads in turn to quite low level of income. And finally, often there are conflicts between the farming production, tourism and environment, seeing that these permanent grassland and extensive grassland are based in high nature value areas too. So how could PLF help with these challenges? Just as a little reminder about the PLF, if we go and think about the animal here, so some biological parameter will be recorded and all the information about the environment will be recorded on sensor. Then this data will be going to model and data analysis to produce a report that can be on a computer, a smartphone, and goes back to the farmer. And then the farmer can anticipate or decide to act and say it gets a warning system. Also, we can have this data going into piloting and informing automated systems that in turn can have some automated action. So in a nutshell, that's what precision livestock farming is about. But how does that apply to a more extensive system? So if we think of the challenge I was mentioning earlier, then I was looking at the different tool we've got and what kind of tool could do. So we could have PLF tool for monitoring because the area are remotely based or harsh environment, or can have a low productivity, or even you can have conflict. So we could use PLF for that. We could also use PLF to send alert or warning system, as I was explaining a bit earlier, and that would alleviate the issues of the harsh environment, the problem of welfare, or even the conflict between the different land use. We could also use PLF to produce common protocol for collecting or monitoring data or giving data directly to inform the farmer and benchmarking. And that would help towards the problem of diversity of system and the sector being perhaps less organized. We could also use a PLF as efficiency gain and time saving, given that the technology is there for that. And that would help for the sector being less organized, the lack of labor, and the low level of income. And finally, these sorts of PLF could spark the interest of the younger generation, so that could alleviate the problem of the aging sector, but also can provide sometimes a better life and work balance, and that might alleviate the problem of lack of labor and replacement of older farmer and renewal of younger generation. And also the low level of income could be helped by having a diversification option. If you've got a better life-work balance, then you've got more time to do something else. So there are potential for using PLF tools to answer the challenge in these extensive grassland systems. Now, what are the recent PLF initiatives that have been in this sector? So what's the state of the art I was talking about earlier? Well, in 2004, we had the legislation on EID, and all animals needed to have an electronic identification tag and be individually identified. We've got two main types of RFID, so radio frequency identification. Either the tags with a fixed or a mobile reader, but more and more the wearables are getting quite popular, so, such as collars or sensor in or on the animal. So when I was looking at what's happening in the extensive grassland system in Europe, I could categorize 5 types of initiatives for PLF that are actually happening. One around feed and water intake and growth monitoring. The second one around grazing behavior. The third around fencing. And the fourth around health and disease management. And finally, the last one on social behavior. So first of all, if we think of the outdoor weight monitoring, so there's been some development done around the walkover weight, which I know is an Australian system at the start, but I'm sure it will be covered in the later talk. But the French team down in Montpellier at the INRA have modified the walkover weight to slow down the animal going through the crate and enable to calculate how much intake they've got when they come in and out of the crate. They've tested that indoors, as you can see on the picture, but also outdoors on the field and even when it was snowing, and it worked. So that's quite an interesting new system for monitoring the weight of your animal. And so the French at the Institut de l'Élevage in France have got this new project called Autop 3D, and they use a walkover weight and linked with some sensors or camera to look at the body condition score of the animal, and they are trying to see if we can have a mixture of the weight and body condition score to predict the growth of the animal. The second initiative I could think of was the grazing behavior, which is really around an efficient pastoral resource management. Some work has been done 10 years ago on our research farm in Scotland, and my colleague managed to, using GPS collar on sheep, to classify the behavior between active and inactive, so between resting and grazing. And based on that, we could monitor where they were grazing in which part of the farm used on the GPS. And more recently, the Institut de l'Élevage in the south of France with the Clochette project have done something similar with a slightly different color, but again trying to look at the different activity and classification of behavior at grazing to inform the farmer. The Italian in Sardinia have also developed a system where they've got a system around the sheep and it can calculate the bite rate and also say where the animal is grazing. And based around that, trying to inform how about nutrition and where the animal is grazing. And finally, on our research farm, we were using GPS collars to look at where the animal were grazing on different type. And again, you can see which type of vegetation they were spending most time in. So again, to inform about grazing choice and grazing behavior. The third developmental initiative is really around the virtual fencing. Because in this large area, extensive grassland system, you very often don't have any fence because it's too big. So how can you know where your animal are? So the Norwegians have developed that system called no fence, and the animal work with a collar, and then they can be contained in an area as defined by the farmer. It works very well for goats, and it's being developed for cattle and sheep now. Then disease and health management. Again, Norwegian colleagues have developed a sensor, a temperature sensor under the skin of the animal, and based in conjunction with some GPS collar, they were able to have a model for detecting disease, in that case, the tick-borne fever, based around the fluctuation in temperature of the animal and based also where they were. And finally, the social behavior. So we've got research done on social network and sentinel animal in France. And again, trying to identify which animal is the most likely to be the leader in a group. And again, if you can use this as sentinels, that can be useful to inform you. And also in Scotland, we've done some work around pedigree matchmaker with collars, trying to mother the lamb with the ewe to avoid mismothering. And again, this proximity logger worked quite well, as you can see on these maps, on these graphs. So to conclude, there is a range of research and application that exists. The list I've given you is not exhaustive. Some are already available on the market, some are still research prototype, and we've got very recent projects that will dwell a little bit more into these issues. So PLF can make a difference in extensive grassland system in Europe, but there is still some needs that need to be addressed. The acceptability of the technology, the economic relevance, the affordability, is it too expensive? And is the industry really engaged in developing in these areas? And also, in the bottom line, we need to have something that's cheap and small to appeal to the extensive grassland system. Thank you very much.